Elara Miles never expected a forced vow to become her only sanctuary, or that the most lethal man in the underworld would be the one to hide her from the dark. At the Jinwu Cathedral, beneath a ceiling dripping in gold and heavy with the scent of lilies and gunpowder, Elara stood in a white satin dress that felt like a shroud. To the elite monsters gathered in the pews, she was just a debt paid in flesh, a soft-featured girl sold to settle a brother's sins. She looked at Kale Jinwu, the Shadow Dawn, whose tattooed neck and cold, commanding gaze usually silenced rooms with a single flicker of his eyes. But as he reached for her hand to slide a diamond-encrusted ring onto her finger, she saw what the rest of the syndicate ignored, a slight tremor in his lethal grip and a flash of weary grief in his eyes that didn't belong to a killer. Breaking the silent protocol of the ceremony, Elara didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his shadow, her wide eyes searching his. She didn't know that Kale had spent 10 years ensuring no one ever got close enough to see the man behind the ink. She didn't know she was stepping into the center of a secret war that could burn the city to ashes. But when Kale leaned down, his lips brushing her ear in a ghost of a touch, something inside the ruthless boss snapped and aligned entirely around her. "Don't look them in the eye," he whispered, his voice a lethal calm that sent shivers down her spine. "Or they'll see you're the only thing I have left to lose." Hi besties, welcome to Mafia Secret Love Stories. Please like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin with the story. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and expensive oak aged the air in the Miles' living room long before the men in dark suits arrived. Elara sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her fingers stained with the charcoal she'd been using to distract herself from the shouting in the study. For weeks, the house had felt like a sinking ship, but that night, the hull finally gave way. When the study door creaked open, her brother Julian stumbled out, his face a mask of ashen terror. Behind him stepped a man who seemed to swallow the light in the room. Kale Jinwu didn't look like the street thugs Julian usually gambled with. He looked like a god of cold precision. His tailored black overcoat was draped over shoulders that carried the weight of a violent empire. And as he adjusted his cufflink, the movement revealed the dark, intricate ink trailing up his neck, a dragon's tail lost beneath a crisp white collar. "Please," Julian rasped, his voice breaking. "I just need more time. The docs, the shipping manifests. I can get you the money." Kale didn't look at him. His intense, dark eyes were fixed on the easel in the corner, and then, with a slow, predatory deliberateness, they shifted to Elara. The air in her lungs turned to lead. It wasn't just fear that spiked through her. It was the sheer force of his presence. He looked at her not as a person, but as a masterpiece he was deciding whether to buy or burn. "You've spent money that wasn't yours, Julian," Kale said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that vibrated in Elara's chest. "And you've offered me collateral that doesn't exist. Your life isn't worth the interest on what you owe." Kale took a step closer to Elara. The scent of sandalwood and something sharp, like ozone before a storm, drifted off him. He reached out, his tattooed hand hovering inches from her face. Elara flinched, her breath hitching, but she didn't look away. In that moment, she saw the lethal calm the city whispered about, a controlled posture that suggested he could kill everyone in the room without breaking a sweat. "But," Kale continued, his gaze dropping to her trembling lips, "your sister has a gift for seeing things others miss. She paints the world as it should be, not as it is." He turned back to Julian, his expression hardening into something jagged. "The debt is settled, but I don't want your shipping manifests. I want a contract of a different kind." "What do you mean?" Julian whispered. "A marriage," Kale stated, the word dropping like a guillotine blade. "A union between the Jinwu syndicate and the Miles name. She stays with me. She becomes mine. And in exchange, you stay alive." Elara felt the world tilt. She was being traded like a canvas, a piece of property to balance a ledger. She looked at Julian, hoping to see him fight, to see him refuse. But his silence was the loudest sound in the room. He looked at the floor, his shoulders slumping in cowardly relief. Kale turned back to her. He stepped into her personal space, forcing her to look up at him. The danger radiating from him was palpable, a physical heat that made her skin prickle. He reached out again, and this time he didn't stop. His thumb brushed a smudge of charcoal from her cheek, the touch surprisingly light, almost reverent, despite the violence etched into his skin. "Don't look so frightened, Elara," he murmured, loud enough only for her to hear. "The monsters outside these walls are far worse than the one standing in front of you." In that terrifying meeting, as the paperwork was signed with the blood of her family's dignity, Elara realized her life had ended. She was no longer an artist. She was a debt paid. As Kale led her toward the black sedan waiting in the rain, she felt the first stirrings of a reluctant safety. He was a predator, yes, but he was now the predator that owned her, and in the dark world of the Jinwu syndicate, that was the only protection she had left. The gates of the Jinwu estate didn't creak. They slid open with a heavy, motorized finality that signaled the end of the world Elara had known. As the black sedan wound up the long, moonlit drive, the mansion rose out of the darkness like a fortress carved from obsidian and glass. It was beautiful, cold, and utterly terrifying. When the car came to a halt, a man in a sharp suit opened her door, but he didn't offer a hand. He stood like a statue, eyes forward, as if Elara were a ghost passing through the living. Kale stepped out from the other side, his presence instantly commanding the space. He didn't wait for her. He simply started toward the massive double doors, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the interior light. Elara followed, her satin heels clicking rhythmically against the marble, a lonely sound that echoed her racing heart. The interior was a masterclass in fortress silk, luxurious textures designed to hide the iron beneath. Deep charcoal walls were adorned with art that looked like it cost more than her family's house, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive beeswax and cold metal. Kale stopped in the center of a sprawling foyer. He turned, the light from the chandelier catching the sharp angles of his face and the dark ink that peeked out from his collar. He looked at her with that same lethal calm, his hands clasped behind his back. "This is your home now, Elara," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "But a home in this world is a machine. If you want to survive, you must learn how the gears turn." He began to walk, and Elara trailed behind him, feeling smaller with every step. He pointed to a hallway guarded by two men who looked more like soldiers than security. "The East Wing is off limits. My offices, the server rooms, the strategy chambers. You are never to enter. If you are found there, even I cannot guarantee the reactions of my men." They passed a grand staircase where a woman in a severe gray uniform waited. "This is Han. She will manage your schedule. You do not leave the grounds without a four-man detail. You do not make personal phone calls. Your old life in the city is a closed book. If you attempt to contact your brother, his protection is revoked. Am I clear?" Elara swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I'm a prisoner, then." Kale stopped and turned so suddenly she nearly walked into his chest. He reached out, his gloved fingers catching her chin, tilting her face up. The intensity in his eyes was suffocating, a mix of possession and something deeper, something hidden. "A prisoner is someone who is kept against their will for a crime," he murmured, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. "You are here as a shield. My name protects you, and your presence here protects the stability of my house. In this world, Elara, the rules aren't meant to restrict you. They are meant to keep you breathing." He let go, his touch leaving a cold trail on her skin. He gestured toward the upper floor. "Your suite has been prepared. It contains everything an artist could need. Paint, canvases, light. Use them. Stay inside the lines I have drawn for you, and you will find I can be a very generous benefactor." He stepped closer, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear, mirroring the intimacy of their wedding vows. "But remember this, my enemies don't see a woman when they look at you. They see a target. They see the only soft thing in my life. Every rule I give you is a brick in the wall I am building around you. Don't try to climb it." He turned on his heel and walked toward the darkness of the East Wing without another word. Elara stood alone in the vast, silent foyer, surrounded by silk and shadows. She looked up the grand staircase toward her gilded cage, realizing that in the Jinwoo household, the most dangerous thing wasn't the violence outside the gates. It was the quiet, crushing weight of the man who claimed to be her protector. The following week was a study in silence. Elara's world had shrunk to the dimensions of her studio, a room filled with the finest oils and canvases money could buy, yet it felt like a cage lined with velvet. From her window, she watched the sentries pace the perimeter, their hands never far from the holsters concealed beneath their jackets. Kale was a ghost, a presence felt in the sudden chilling of the air or the hushed whispers of the staff, but he never visited her. Restlessness finally overcame fear. On a Tuesday night, when the mansion was draped in the heavy quiet of 3 in the morning, Elara found herself wandering the darkened corridors. She told herself she was looking for the library, but her feet led her toward the east wing, the forbidden territory. The warnings Kale had whispered in her ear should have turned her back, but as an artist, she was drawn to the truth hidden beneath the surface of things. She found his office door slightly ajar, a sliver of blue light spilling onto the marble floor. The guards who usually stood like iron pillars were nowhere to be seen, likely pulled away by some midnight crisis at the docks. Heart hammering against her ribs, Elara pushed the door open. The room smelled of expensive tobacco and old paper. It was a workspace of a man who dealt in life and death. On the massive mahogany desk sat a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It looked out of place next to the sleek, modern monitors displaying flickering security feeds of the city. Elara knew she should leave, but the ledger seemed to pulse with a gravity of its own. She opened it, expecting to see columns of laundered money, drug shipments, or the names of politicians bought and sold. Instead, her eyes landed on a series of handwritten notes in the margins, dates, times, and coordinates that had nothing to do with profit. Chairman Park, Warehouse 4, narcotics shipment tipped to Interpol, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She flipped the pages, her pulse accelerating. There were lists of syndicate members, but beside each name was a meticulous record of their crimes, followed by a stamp that chilled her blood, evidence transmitted. There were bank account numbers for offshore accounts belonging to the Jinwoo family, all marked for seizure. This wasn't a record of an empire, it was a roadmap for its destruction. You were told never to come here. The voice was a low vibration that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. Elara gasped, the ledger slipping from her numb fingers and hitting the desk with a heavy thud. Kale stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. He had discarded his jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the jagged edges of the dragon tattoo on his chest. He looked more dangerous than she had ever seen him, his eyes dark with a lethal intensity. He walked toward her, each step measured and silent. Elara backed away until her hips hit the desk, trapping her between the incriminating book and the man who owned it. Kale didn't stop until he was in her space, his shadow swallowing her whole. "What did you see, Elara?" he murmured, his voice a dangerous caress. You're destroying them," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "Your own people. You're not the Shadow Dawn. You're the one tearing the shadow down." Kale leaned in, pinning her against the desk with his weight. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the ledger, closing it with a finality that echoed through the room. His face was inches from hers, and for the first time, she didn't see the cold mask of a Mafia king. She saw the raw, jagged edges of a man who had sacrificed his soul to play a part. "I am the monster they created," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "And I am the only one who can burn this world to the ground. But now you know the secret, Elara. And in this house, secrets don't just stay hidden, they stay buried." He didn't move away. Instead, his gaze dropped to her lips, and in that moment of shared peril, the line between protector and predator vanished entirely. Elara realized she hadn't just discovered a secret, she had become a part of it. The silence in the office was so heavy it felt physical, pressing against Elara's lungs as she stared into Kale's dark, unreadable eyes. She expected a threat, a flash of steel, or the cold click of a lock. Instead, Kale's grip on the ledger loosened, and he let out a jagged breath that seemed to crack the foundation of his Shadow Dawn persona. You weren't supposed to see the rot beneath the floorboards, Elara, he whispered, his voice stripped of its lethal edge. He moved back just enough to let her breathe, though he didn't let her go. He looked at the ledger, then back at her, his expression a haunting mixture of exhaustion and calculation. Now that you are the greatest liability I have ever carried, or the only chance I have at finishing this. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. Why me? You have an army, Kale. You have power. I have soldiers who follow orders, but I have no one I can trust with the truth, he admitted, the admission sounding like a confession of sin. He paced the small space between the desk and the window, the blue light of the monitors casting sharp shadows across his tattooed neck. The syndicate is a hydra. Every time I cut off a head like Chairman Park, 2 more grow in the shadows. My lieutenants are growing suspicious. They see me dismantling their profits, and they are looking for the leak. They expect a spy to be a man with a gun, not a woman with a paintbrush. He stopped and looked at her, his gaze intense, pinning her to the spot. They watch me. They monitor my calls, my movements, my meetings. But they don't watch you. To them, you are a trophy. Fragile. Invisible. You can move through this house and the social circles of the elite in ways I never can. Elara shook her head, her hands trembling. I'm an artist, Kale. I don't know how to be a spy. I don't know how to lie to men who kill for a living. You've been lying since the day you got here, he countered softly, stepping back into her space. He reached out, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. You lie every time you pretend you don't feel the pull between us. You lie every time you look at me with fear instead of what's actually there. He leaned down, his forehead nearly touching hers. The scent of sandalwood and danger was intoxicating, a dark romance fueled by the shared weight of a lethal secret. I can't do this alone anymore, Elara. If I fall, the men who replace me will be monsters you cannot imagine. My dangerous secret is the only thing keeping your brother alive. If you help me, I can finish this. I can burn the Jinwu name to ash, and we can both walk away. And if I refuse, she whispered. Kale's eyes darkened, a flash of that possessive authority returning. I won't hurt you, but the walls of this fortress will become very thick, and the silence will become absolute. You will be safe, but you will be alone in the dark. Elara looked at the ledger, then at the man who had bought her life only to offer her a chance to save his. The vulnerability she had seen in the cathedral wasn't a fluke, it was a plea. She realized that her reluctant safety was over. To stay safe, she had to become dangerous. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice steadying. A ghost of a smile touched Kale's lips, not a cruel one, but the look of a man who had finally found an anchor in a storm. He reached for a small, encrypted drive hidden in the desk's false bottom and placed it in her palm, his hand closing over hers. I need you to be my eyes where I am blind, he murmured. From this moment on, we are more than husband and wife. We are accomplices. And in this world, Elara, that is the only bond that truly holds. The Grand Orchid Ballroom was a sea of lace, silk, and gold leaf, a gilded cage designed to mask the predators lurking within. Under the heavy, shimmering weight of a silver masquerade mask, Elara felt the sweat prickle against her neck. This was no longer a forced marriage, it was an operation. Kale stood beside her, the embodiment of lethal authority. His black mask emphasized the sharp line of his jaw and the dark intensity of his eyes. As they moved through the crowd of Seoul's most dangerous elites, his hand remained possessively on the small of her back. To the world, he was the Shadow Dawn flaunting his latest acquisition. To Elara, his touch was a rhythmic signal, a reminder to stay focused. Chairman Yu is watching from the balcony, Kale murmured, his lips barely moving as they accepted glasses of vintage champagne. He expects you to be bored. He expects you to be the fragile doll he thinks I bought. Give him the show he wants. Elara nodded, her wide, uncertain eyes scanning the room with practiced vulnerability. When Kale leaned down to kiss her temple, he didn't just offer affection. He pressed a small, cold device into her palm, the transmitter he needed to plant and use private study. As Kale moved toward a group of lieutenants to discuss business, Elara began her play. She drifted through the ballroom, the distracted wife, personified, pausing to admire the heavy oil paintings and the ornate floral arrangements. She looked restless, her slight lean into the shadows suggesting a woman suffocating under her husband's gaze. She slipped through a side door into a corridor lined with darkened wood and the scent of expensive cigars. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that threatened to give her away. She reached Yu's study, her fingers trembling as she pulled the device from her clutch. She remembered Kale's instructions. Under the mahogany desk, left corner, near the floor. She was kneeling, her fingers searching the underside of the desk, when the door creaked open. "Lost your way, Mrs. Jinwoo." The voice was like serrated glass. Elara froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stood up slowly, clutching her evening bag to her chest, and turned to face Lieutenant Park, Kale's most suspicious and ambitious subordinate. He stood in the doorway, his mask removed, revealing eyes that were cold and calculating. He didn't see a woman, he saw a target. I was looking for the powder room," Elara whispered, her voice trembling with a genuine fear that she didn't have to fake. "The hallways are so confusing, and Kale told me not to wander, but—" Park took a step into the room, his gaze darting toward the desk. "The powder rooms are in the opposite wing. You seem quite interested in the chairman's private quarters." He moved closer, his hand reaching out to catch her chin, his grip far rougher than Kale's had ever been. "You're a soft thing, Elara. Too soft for a man like Kale. Perhaps you're looking for something more than a bathroom. Perhaps you're looking for leverage." "I don't know what you mean," she gasped, her wide eyes filling with tears. Just as Park's grip tightened, a shadow fell across the doorway. Kale stood there, his presence turning the air to ice. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't have to. The lethal calm, radiating from him, was more terrifying than any blade. "Park," Kale said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Is there a reason your hand is on my wife?" Park flinched, his fingers dropping from Elara's face as if she had suddenly turned to fire. "I was merely guiding her back to the ballroom, Dawn." She seemed lost. Kale stepped into the room, pulling Elara into his side with a possessiveness that felt like a shield. He stared at Park until the lieutenant lowered his gaze, his bravado crumbling. "Go back to the floor. We are leaving." When the door closed behind Park, Kale turned to Elara. His eyes searched hers, looking for the device. She gave a single, microscopic nod. The bug was planted. "You did well," he murmured, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. But as they walked back into the light of the ballroom, Elara felt the shift. The dangerous secret was no longer just a ledger in an office. It was a target on her back. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the primary suite, blurring the Seoul skyline into a smear of neon and charcoal. Inside, the air was thick with the adrenaline of their narrow escape from the gala. Elara sat on the edge of the sprawling silk-covered bed, her hands finally ceasing their tremble, while Kale paced the room like a caged predator. He had stripped off his dress shirt, the intricate tattoos across his back and shoulders gleaming under the dim amber light. For the first time, Elara didn't look away from the ink. She saw the dragons, the flames, and the jagged scars that wove between them, marks of a life lived in the mouth of a furnace. "You did something tonight I never should have asked of you," Kale said, his voice a low, rough vibration. He stopped pacing and turned toward her, the light catching the lethal calm of his features, but his eyes were different, darker, haunted by a ghost she hadn't met yet. "I chose to do it, Kale," Elara whispered, standing up to meet him in the center of the room. "But if we are accomplices, I need to know why. Why is a man who owns the city trying so hard to burn it down?" Kale remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the glass. Then, he reached for a small, silver locket hidden inside a velvet-lined drawer of his nightstand. He didn't open it. He just gripped it until his knuckles turned white. 15 years ago, this syndicate wasn't mine. It belonged to my father, he began, his voice devoid of its usual authority. He was a man of honor, or as much honor as this life allows. He wanted out. He had a plan to go legitimate, to move us to the coast where the air didn't smell like blood and diesel. He took a step closer to her, his shadow stretching long across the floor. The lieutenants found out. Chairman Park, they didn't want a legitimate life. They wanted a king who would let them be monsters. They set the fire themselves. I watched the house burn with my mother and sister inside because I was too small, too weak to break the locks they had placed on the outside. The lethal calm finally shattered. His jaw tightened, and a single, sharp breath escaped him, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. They took me in afterward. They raised me to be the heir they wanted, tattooing their loyalty into my skin while I waited for the day I was strong enough to wrap my hands around their throats. Every life I've taken, every shipment I've seized, has been a stone in the wall I've been building to trap them. He looked down at his hands that were currently shaking. I'm not a hero, Elara. I'm the ash that's left after the fire. I've lived in the dark so long I don't know if there's anything left of the boy who wanted to see the ocean. Elara felt a lump form in her throat, her reluctant safety transforming into a fierce, protective ache. She reached out, her fingers hesitantly touching the ink on his chest, right over his heart. He flinched at the contact, but he didn't pull away. Underneath the cold skin of the shadow dawn, his heart was thundering against his ribs, frantic and human. There is, she murmured, her wide, uncertain eyes holding his. I see him. He's the man who whispered to me at the altar. He's the man who gave me a paintbrush instead of a gun. Cale closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. The vulnerability was absolute. In this moment of dark romance, the possession was no longer one-sided. He wasn't just holding her. He was clinging to her, as if she were the only thing tethering him to a world that wasn't made of shadows. If I finish this, he whispered into the space between them, there will be nothing left of the Jinwu name. No money, no power, no protection. Just me, broken and covered in ink. Then we'll start with a blank canvas, Elara replied, her voice steady for the first time since she'd arrived in Seoul. In the silence of the fortress, the dawn disappeared, leaving only the man behind the ink, and for the first time, the marriage didn't feel like a contract. It felt like a beginning. The peace they had found in the quiet of the primary suite was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent death of the mansion's lights. For a heartbeat, the room was plunged into an absolute, suffocating blackness. Then, the crimson glow of the emergency backup system flickered to life, bathing the walls in the color of a warning. Cale was on his feet before the first pane of glass exploded downstairs. The lethal calm returned to his features instantly, but it was edged with a raw desperation Elara hadn't seen before. He reached into the nightstand, pulling out a sleek, black handgun and checking the chamber with a metallic click that sounded like a death knell. They found the drive, Cale said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. Park didn't go back to the ballroom. He went to the servers. Cale, the guards. The guards out front are Park's men now, he interrupted, grabbing her hand and pulling her toward the hidden service staircase behind the dressing room. The breach is internal. They aren't here to arrest me, Elara. They're here to erase the evidence and everyone who touched it. They moved through the narrow corridors as the sound of heavy gunfire began to echo through the marble halls below. The fortress of silk had become a slaughterhouse. As they reached the secondary landing, a door burst open. Two men in tactical gear, their faces masked, leveled submachine guns at them. Cale shoved Elara behind a decorative stone pillar and opened fire. The hallway erupted in a deafening roar of cordite and splintering wood. He moved with the terrifying efficiency of the man he was raised to be, dropping both attackers in a matter of seconds. But as he turned to reach for Elara, his foot slipped on the polished floor. He let out a choked groan, his shoulder hitting the wall as blood began to bloom through his white shirt. Cale. Elara scrambled to his side, her wide eyes fixing on the jagged shrapnel embedded in his side from a stray ricochet. He was pale, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged bursts. Go, he wheezed, pressing the spare magazine into her trembling hand. The back garage, the black SUV. The keys are in the visor. If you leave now, They'll be too focused on me to follow. I am not leaving you to be a martyr for a ledger, Elara snapped. This soft-featured woman, who had arrived in Seoul weeks ago, was gone, burned away by the heat of the moment. She looked at the tactical radio dropped by one of the downed men. It was crackling with Park's voice, directing a second team to the garage to cut off their exit. They're already at the cars, she whispered, her mind racing with the tactical clarity of an artist seeing a composition. She looked at Kale, then at the heavy canister of industrial cleaning solvent in the janitor's closet behind them and the collection of high-proof spirits in the lounge across the hall. "Can you stand?" she asked, her voice steadying into something fierce. "Elara, what are you?" "I've spent my life making things out of nothing, Kale. Tonight, I'm making a distraction." As the heavy boots of the hit squad thundered up the stairs, Elara didn't freeze. She worked with a frantic, precise grace, dousing the expensive silk tapestries in the solvent and creating a trail of high-proof alcohol toward the ventilation shaft. When the first masked man rounded the corner, she didn't scream. She struck a match and dropped it. The dark noir world exploded in a roar of orange flame. The fire raced up the silk, creating a wall of heat and smoke that blinded the attackers and triggered the heavy fire suppression chemicals, filling the hallway with a white, choking fog. In the chaos, Elara stepped out from behind the pillar. She didn't use the gun to kill. She used it to suppress, firing into the ceiling and the walls as Kale had taught her, the noise and the muzzle flashes creating the illusion of a full security detail. "Now," she hissed, hauling Kale's arm over her shoulder. They moved through the smoke, a ghost and a king, as the men behind them scrambled in the confusion. For the first time, Elara wasn't leaning into Kale for reluctant safety. He was leaning on her, and as they reached the hidden basement exit, she realized she had finally shed her vulnerability. She wasn't just his accomplice, she was his spine. The cold air of the underground bunker smelled of damp concrete and the copper tang of Kale's blood. While the mansion burned above them, a funeral pyre for their old lives, Kale sat slumped against a server rack, his face gaunt under the flickering fluorescent lights. Elara worked with steady hands, tearing strips from her satin dress to bind the wound in his side. The fabric, once a symbol of her status as a trophy, was now a blood-stained bandage. "It's time," Kale rasped, his eyes fluttering open to meet hers. There was no lethal calm left, only a raw, terminal resolve. He reached for the terminal, his fingers hovering over the keys. "Once I hit enter, the Jinwoo accounts are drained. The digital footprints of every shipment, every bribe, and every murder will be broadcast to every major intelligence agency in the hemisphere. There is no going back. We become ghosts." Elara placed her hand over his, her fingers interlacing with his tattooed ones. "I never wanted the gold, Kale. I just wanted the man." With a final, decisive keystroke, Kale triggered the Ash and Ember protocol. On the monitors, rows of data began to scroll at light speed, turning red as they were purged from the private servers and pushed into the public domain. In that moment, the Jinwoo Syndicate, a monster that had breathed for generations, suffered a total cardiovascular collapse. Wealth that could buy countries vanished into untraceable offshore charities. Records that protected kings were unsealed. But Kale wasn't finished. He pulled a heavy, old-fashioned detonator from the console. "The mansion is wired," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the screen showing the internal security feed. He watched as Park and his men scrambled through the smoke upstairs, realizing too late that the Empire was dissolving beneath their feet. They think they're fighting for a throne. They don't realize the palace is made of gunpowder. Kale looked at Elara, a silent question in his eyes. He was asking for her permission to destroy the only home she had known in Seoul, the place where their dark romance had first sparked into something real. "Burn it," she whispered. "Burn it all." Kale pressed the trigger. The ground beneath them groaned as a series of muffled thuds vibrated through the bunker's reinforced walls. Above, the grand foyer, the silk-lined halls, and the forbidden east wing collapsed into a singular, roaring inferno. To the world watching from the city, it would look like an assassination, the tragic end of the Shadow Dawn and his bride in a rival hit. The heat seeped through the ceiling, a physical weight that signaled the end. Kale leaned his head back against the rack, a ghost of a smile touching his lips as the monitors finally went black. The dragon on his neck seemed to fade into the shadows. Kale Jinwoo is dead, he said, his voice a mere shadow of the authority it once held. Then let's see who's left, Elara replied. She helped him to his feet, her slight frame supporting his heavy weight as they moved toward the narrow escape tunnel that led to the sea. They emerged onto a jagged cliffside an hour later, the salt spray of the ocean stinging their faces. Behind them, the glow of the fire painted the sky in shades of bruised orange and violent purple. The dangerous secret was gone, replaced by a terrifying, beautiful freedom. As they stepped into the small, nondescript boat waiting in the surf, Elara looked at Kale. No longer a dawn, no longer a predator, but a man finally standing in the light. The embers of their past were still falling like snow, but for the first time, the air smelled like nothing but the sea. 3 years later, the light was different. It wasn't the neon glare of Seoul or the oppressive amber of a guarded fortress. It was the soft, golden haze of a Mediterranean morning, filtering through the open windows of a villa tucked away in a quiet coastal village. Here, the air smelled of salt and wild jasmine, and the only sounds were the distant crashing of waves and the rhythmic scratching of a charcoal pencil against paper. Elara sat on the sun-drenched veranda, her easel positioned to catch the perfect morning glow. She worked with a fluidity she had never known in her old life. Before, her art had been a refuge from fear, a way to paint a world that didn't hurt. Now, it was a celebration of the truth. In front of her, Kale sat in a simple, oversized cream sweater, a stark contrast to the sharp, dark suits that used to be his armor. The thick wool covered the dragons on his arms and the jagged ink on his neck, hiding the shadow dawn from a world that had long ago pronounced him dead. His hair was longer now, softer, and the lethal calm that once terrified rooms had settled into a genuine, quiet peace. He wasn't looking at a security monitor or a ledger of blood. He was looking at a book, his brow furrowed in concentration, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling on the table beside him. "You're overthinking the shading again," Kale murmured, not looking up from his page, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. Elara laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed off the stone walls. "And you're still too observant for your own good. Sit still, Kale. I'm almost at the eyes." When he finally looked up, Elara stopped her hand. She didn't see a predator or a protector tangled in possession. She saw the man who had walked through fire to give her a blank canvas. The intensity was still there, but the shadows behind his pupils had been replaced by a deep, grounded devotion. She began to apply color to the canvas, vibrant blues, warm ochres, and the soft pink of the morning sky. This was her masterpiece. She wasn't painting a legend or a ghost. She was painting a husband. She captured the way his shoulders had finally dropped their burden, the way his hands, once instruments of violence, now tended to the small garden behind their home with a surprising, patient gentleness. Kale stood up and walked over to stand behind her, his presence no longer a heavy weight, but a warm, familiar shield. He wrapped his arms around her waist, leaning his chin on her shoulder as he studied the portrait. In the painting, the dragon on his neck was barely a faint line, overshadowed by the light she had poured into his expression. "Is that how you see me?" he whispered, his breath warm against her cheek. "It's who you are," Elara replied, leaning back into him. "The ink is just a story we finished reading a long time ago." Outside their gates, the village went about its day, unaware that a former emperor lived among them. To the locals, he was simply the quiet man who loved his wife and lived for the sea. The dangerous secret had been buried under the ashes of a mansion halfway across the world, replaced by a life where the only contract was the one they renewed with every look, every touch, and every sunrise. Elara took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, feeling the solid reality of their freedom. The dark romance that had begun in a cathedral of gunpowder had transformed into a life of unshadowed color. They were no longer victims or accomplices. They were simply two souls who had found their way home. And as the sun rose higher, painting the world in gold, Elara knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving the story, she was finally living it.